to peaceably to assemble or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, our life would be much simpler if in the 1700s they'd been following Strunk and White's rules of writing and weren't big fans of the compound sentence. But when we get to the point, so the first one is make low law respecting an establishment of religion. Why is this here? It's here because for the 200, so this is written in the, let's call it 1780. As it's being written, they've just lived through almost 260 years of continuous religious warfare in Europe. Almost as soon as Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517, religious war broke out in Europe and continued almost literally without break, at least until the 1680s, and then continued to be a major source of friction in European politics right up to the moment the Constitution's written. The wars of religion in the 1500s and 1600s in Europe are the most destructive wars we have good records for. At least a third of the population of Central Europe died in those wars. In many regions, up to 2/3 of the population of Central Europe died. The wars were almost unremittingly continuous. We have a period called the 80 Years' War, ending in 1648. The 30 Years' War ending in 1648, of 30 years of continuous warfare across Europe. And all of those wars were, though they had many causes, were justified, taught about, propagandized, and the coalitions were about religion in many senses. And then those conflicts spilled over into Great Britain, into England, and were the power behind the English Civil War. The English Civil War, whoever was losing at the time or had temporarily lost, spurred waves of immigration into America. Virginia and the southern colonies largely founded by and many of the immigrants were the losers on the Royalist side, the Church of England side. Many of the immigrants to New England were the temporary losers on the Puritan, Roundhead, unestablished church, different names, right? Sides. And as the Constitution's being written, the writers, the framers of the Constitution are almost all deeply religious men as far as we can tell, but deeply religious in very different ways. Has anybody ever read Jefferson's New Testament? Jefferson wrote his own version of the New Testament where he took out all the supernatural elements, among other things. So the framers of the Constitution are all religious people, but they're all religious in different ways. Apparently the largest debate, the longest lasting debate in the writing of the Constitution was who was going to say the opening prayer and what denomination he was from. The solution was, we're all deeply religious in different ways. Therefore, to protect all of our religion, let's keep the state from establishing a religion. What does that mean? So the idea of the established church in early modern Europe was the church that was part of the state. So in England at this time, in France at this time, and in the various Germanies, there's no Germany at this time, there's 300-ish principalities that would later become Germany. In Italy, etc., Spain, the church in all of those regions was enmeshed with, entangled with the state. Part of your taxes that you could be punished for not paying by the state was your mandatory tithe. in almost all these countries. If in a lot of them, especially the Calvinist countries, at this time Scotland and parts of Switzerland, various German states, if you didn't show up to church, you could be fined. You could be punished. You were excluded in England right up until the end of the 19th century. You were excluded from offices if you weren't a member of the Church of England. Same in France. If you were not a member of the Catholic Church in good standing, you theoretically couldn't serve in all kinds of different political positions in the army, etc. That's what they mean by an established religion.
In fact, in Germany, they still do payroll deduction for your
Mm-hmm. Right, so this hasn't completely gone away. And these things, most of these things in Europe lasted well into the 20th century. When we talk about the right and the left in politics, we're actually referring back to the Estates General at the beginning of the French Revolution, when the king called together his equivalent of a parliament or a congress, the Estates General. And those who were in support of the king and the church sat on the right, and those who were for at the beginning, minimizing, and later they radicalized to abolishing and then executing the aristocracy, the king, and the church, sat on the left. That's where we get the terms right and left in politics. It's where people sat on this debate in that room. And so the American solution was a radical one. The American solution was, let's take church out of the state. The way to guarantee that I can worship as I see fit is for me to say, I have no right to use the power of the state to force anybody else to worship as I see fit. Now, I don't know if is that how the First Amendment is taught in American schools? No? Especially not today. It's freedom from religion. It's freedom of religion. I had a really interesting Canada in its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the rough equivalent of the Constitution in Canada, of the Bill of Rights in Canada, has a similar law. And when I was in high school, my high school was right next to a big campus ministry we had at the biggest university in Toronto, University of York. And the way our campus ministries operated is we formed a club that was like a recognized club under the structure of the university. And that way we had rights to meeting rooms and funding and rights to hold events on campus, and we're covered by the insurance and all the legal stuff you need to do to be on a campus. It's York University, it's Toronto, it's one of the most diverse places on the face of the earth. Toronto in the late 90s, about half the population was born in a foreign country, and literally everywhere. Our church represented almost 60 nations, and it's 3,000 people. And very, very diverse, and we were on campus, and so there is 2 or 3 Muslim clubs, 2 or 3 Jewish students associations, Catholic students associations, whatever, and we founded our Church of Christ club. And they really didn't like it. The school really didn't like it. Somebody at the school got the idea that we were a cult, and we were brainwashing people, and they banned our club on campus. Well, one of the members of our church was an incredibly skilled and aggressive lawyer. She's one of the, I've seen her argue a few times. She's one of the most devastating arguers I've ever heard in person. And she was like, "Oh, really? Lovely. Let's go to campus. Let's take pictures of the Muslim club, the Shia club, the Sunni club, the Jewish Students Association, the Catholic students, the Gay and Lesbian Students Association." She gathers all this evidence, and she comes up and she goes to the board at the university and says, "Listen, we have absolutely no problem with the Gay and Lesbian Students Association. We have absolutely no problem with the Jewish Students Association. We have absolutely no problem with the Muslim Students Association. We're fine with that. But if they're allowed to hand out their literature and hold events on campus and go and try and get members on campus, you have no legal right to do that to us. You have no legal right to ban us from campus. And the university's decision was overturned. An example of sort of this principle in action, right? We don't play favorites. We don't establish religion. We allow everyone to say whatever they want in every public space. I really like that law because it lets me know what people are thinking, and then I can judge them on it. I really want to hear what people think, and I really want to hear what people think is correct and appropriate to say in public. You'll notice that the First Amendment doesn't say anything about not judging people for what they're saying. It just says we're going to let them do it. So what kind of scares me is I feel like we have a current, and this isn't new, there has always been a current in our society, in every society, where there are certain groups of religious people who say, we should use the state to enforce our values on society. And that's more common throughout history than not. In most societies, going all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans, and the Egyptians, obviously, before the Greeks and the Romans, you could say there was literally no difference between the religious establishment and the government, right? The Pharaoh of Egypt was also the high priest of their religion. In the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, those things were the same. Even in Rome to an extent, right? I think I've told this story a bunch of times, but Crystal and I, one time we were on vacation in Rome when we lived in Istanbul, and we're walking around and we see this classical monument, and it has a long title on it about who built it. And the title on the building is Pontifex Maximus. Okay, cool. And we're trying to figure out how old this building is. It's Rome, so it could be 2,000 years old, or it could be Renaissance reproduction. The problem is the title Pontifex Maximus tells us 0, because Pontifex Maximus means bridge builder in chief. And it was the title of the high priests of the Roman Republic. It was also one of the honorary titles of all the emperors, and it is also the title of the Pope. Literally the same words. Pontifex Maximus, bridge builder in chief. Not very helpful when you then we're like, which one is that? And this is where it gets really confusing because some of the emperors and some of the popes use the same name. And you're like, huh, okay. And so in most societies throughout history, right, there's been a unification between the established religion and the state. And the state very often is able to justify its laws, or as Bob pointed out last week very well, its threats. The difference between a law and a threat, it's just a couple letters. One of my favorite political scientists says that the only difference between a government and a gang is scale. And they are able to then justify their laws on the basis of saying, we are ensuring, in so many words, righteousness. We are making sin illegal. And in most religion, most society, there's no difference between those concepts.
And for a long time in the U.S., there were, and still are in some places, blue laws that effectively try to legislate morality.
Yeah, and we are not free of that. And I don't think any society is free of that idea, right? That somehow, through laws, we can make people more moral, right? And a lot of this has to do with corporate understandings of religion and righteousness. Many places in the Bible, many places in other religious texts, Leviticus, for example. There's all these ideas about impurity. Leviticus is full of examples of you have a skin disease, right? You need to go and purify yourself before you're admitted to society. And if you don't, you contaminate society. You make society impure, and God will punish you, the society, for one of your members being impure. And that's a really common understanding of righteousness all throughout the Bible. And it's a really common understanding of the role of religion in many societies throughout history. Now, my understanding and my reading of the New Testament is that Jesus rejects this understanding. Now, I know that that's not a common or the only possible reading of that. But I look at the Sermon on the Mount, for example, and I see righteousness at the individual level. And not just individuals' actions, but Jesus is saying, no, you need to be righteous in your heart, in your thoughts, in your mind. It's not murder that's wrong, it's anger. It's not adultery that's wrong, it's lust. It's not theft that's wrong, it's greed. Deal with it at the root. Deal with it inside you. Deal with it at the individual level. And both of those ideas about righteousness exist in our society. So, when I see, what's my role in this? How does this affect us? How do we act on this? I'm personally deeply suspicious of laws that are supposed to make people righteous. Prohibition in America, right? The history of prohibition in America deeply supported by religious movements, deeply connected to the Second Great Awakening, and then its follow-on, deeply connected with ideas about purity, deeply connected to ideas about women's rights, deeply connected to 19th century evangelicalism. 19th century evangelicalism saw itself largely as a social justice movement. Because we are saved, because we have been made righteous, we should go out and try and bring justice to the world. We should try and eliminate suffering. Deeply connected to feminism, right? A lot of men drank away their entire paychecks. Very common in the 19th century, for example, for wage workers to be paid at the local bar, often owned by the guy paying. Hey, it's Friday night. We're going to pay you your paycheck for the week. We'll do that at the bar. First drink's free on us. All kinds of stories from that time period of men walking home with no money in their pocket for their week of work. They spent it all at the bar. The result of that was prohibition, eventually. Did prohibiting alcohol in America create good? No. Did it reduce drinking? Actually, there's some stats that say that it did. Probably reduced the amount of alcohol people drank. Americans pre-prohibition drank. I think the 19th century average was something like 3 or 4 gallons of beer per male citizen per week, along with half a gallon of hard liquor. Yeah, the stats are insane. People drank all day, every day, pre-prohibition. Beer for breakfast was extremely common. The Puritans were considered, like non-alcoholics because they only drank low-alcohol beer for breakfast. So, yeah. But did prohibition work, right? And then we've had all kinds of attempts in America, right? We've had the war on drugs. Excellent business move if you're in the recreational pharmaceutical import-export business in Mexico. Thank you, America, for the war on drugs. You've now created, by some estimates, 3 of the 10 richest people on earth are Mexican drug dealers. Yeah. Sunday blue laws. Yep. And then we get into all the stuff around sex and sexuality and birth control and abortion and all those kind of things, right? All these attempts by different people at different times to think we can impose righteousness in the world. Does doing that, if we support those kind of activities, does that make us a better Christian, a worse Christian? Is it indifferent? As we talked about last week, one of the huge questions I have about all this is why didn't Jesus impose a state? Why didn't, if you can miraculously feed 5,000 people, can't you miraculously feed an army? If you command legions of angels, can't you come down and take over the Roman Empire? If you can raise the dead, couldn't he have healed his injured in battle? Couldn't Jesus have been a victorious general and gone out and conquered the world? 600 years after Jesus, another prophet came, Muhammad, and he went out and in 2 generations conquered the world from Morocco to China. His followers. Why didn't that happen? Why wasn't that God's choice? Right.
And Jesus is looking for a change of heart. And that happens at an individual level. And it has to be a free choice, or else it's not a valid change of heart.
It's about right. Now, we can, that's my belief. Right? My belief is, do a little thought experiment. Imagine you lived in a society where every sin the Bible considers sin was against the law. And every one of them was punished. And and you were monitored all the time, and so they knew when you sinned. If you didn't break any of the laws, would you be righteous? Yeah.
I was going to say, under the Jewish law, they still weren't. That's what Jesus pointed out, because they were doing it because it was a set of laws, not because their heart wanted it.
Right.
They were afraid.
So most religions, I remember when I went to Turkey, and we were trying to explain, I can't remember how I got into this conversation with our fellow English teachers, but who were Turkish. But we were trying to explain the difference between good and legal. And in their culture, there was no difference. In their culture, there was only, I followed the rules, I followed the laws of the state and my religion, or I didn't. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else mattered.
I believe in some Oriental cultures, it's not whether you follow the law,
Yeah. Yeah. Which reminds me of some old customers of mine. Yeah. They had they had a rule called Big Boy Rules, which is do whatever you want, but accept the consequences if you get caught. So when I consider things, like should we, okay, what's going on in America right now, right? Should we ban abortion? Okay, that's an option. I myself, my father was given up for adoption in the 50s by a very young woman who'd become pregnant. If abortion was easily available in America, in Canada in the early 50s, I probably wouldn't be here. Generally not a fan. There's a program in one of the states right now, in Colorado, that's reduced abortions by about 65%. They did this by increasing sex education in high school, giving out free birth control in high school. What's right? Do we want to ban things? Do we want to punish people for sinning? Or do we want to give them more options? What's right? Do I want to throw the drug user in jail? Or do I want to put them in therapy? In places that have done this, the people who go to therapy are less likely to be users 10 years later than the ones who went to jail. They're more likely to have a stable job. They're more likely to not be homeless. Christianity, as we talked about last week, right, emerged at a time when it was completely divorced from state power. The Christians were as far from power most of the time as you could possibly be. Right? A lot of Christians were slaves. A lot of Christians were women, and the legal distinction between women and slaves in the Roman Empire was there, but not big, right? Still property. Had absolutely no political power. A lot of Christians were Jews, especially after the second Jewish revolt in 130. Might be better in many situations to be a slave than a Jew. And so this isn't an issue to address, really, in the New Testament. And in the Old Testament, it's addressed in ways that don't fit, right? When people are like, oh, we should do that because that's the law in Leviticus. And I'm like, awesome, what percentage of the laws in Leviticus do you follow? Right? 5, 3, 2. Right. So these are things I don't have answers for. But I think they're questions we need to seriously consider as Christians.
It was the prophecy that was given, is that I will give them a new law that will be written on their hearts. So this is where we are. That's what Jesus brought. So you ask, why did Jesus not bring a nation state?
Right.
That is why. Because now the nation is within us.
Right.
It's within our hearts. That's where the law is.
And so when we live in a country, in a society, where the largest group of people consider themselves Christians, and we consider ourselves Christians, what do we demonstrate? What do we argue for? What do we fight for? What do we post on social media about? What attitudes do we represent? Who do we vote for? I mean, I have such a hard time voting. Because every politician I look at, pretty much, I'm like, wow, I wouldn't even want to have coffee with that guy. I don't want to be in the same room with him. And then if you look back at the history of their statements, it's like, what does he stand for? Whatever's popular at the time.
Which actually is a reasonable thing for politicians.
It's exactly what our system is set up to do, right?
Supposed to represent the people, so
Right. And so we actually have power in the sense that we can represent our ideas publicly.
And I think it's okay to stand and vote for those these laws, but not to vote it when sin is legal. We can still live in a world where sin is legal and not sin.
Yeah, absolutely, right? We can be exposed to it. Where did Jesus spend his time on earth? With the sinners. Yeah. Right. Did Jesus hole himself away in a cave? No. Did Jesus hang out in the temple courts all day, all night? Sometimes. Sometimes he hid himself away in a cave. But a lot of the time he went and engaged with the people who weren't in the synagogue. Right. The tax collector thing. The more I learned about Roman tax collecting, the more I realized they were probably some of the more I'm shocked that the Gospels mention them so much. Right? The more I'm like, they're making statements. Right? Tax collectors and sinners. I think they meant tax collectors and other sinners. In Roman society, the tax collectors were what we call a tax farmer. So they were given a region, and they were like, hey, we need this many dollars from that region. We don't care how much you collect over that. We don't care who you collect it from. Anything over what you owe us, you get to keep, tax collector. Tax farming is the second largest source of revolt in human history, after starvation. Usually they're connected. Tax farming tends to lead to starvation. It's like ancient communism. So, yeah. Any other thoughts on this? How are you thinking about this? How are you engaging with these topics? How are you talking about them with your family?
I think I said before that one of the important things for politicians is the ability to compromise.
Right.
You get your bill passed by helping somebody get their bill passed,
Right.
or you modify your bill to make it more acceptable to more people.
Yep.
And if it's an ethical or moral issue, that's very difficult for a Christian. Or should be.
So here's, and I hear that. Here's a thought. Does it compromise my ethics or my morals for the state I live in to not impose morality?
There's also the people in opposite that is true. The laws that make it more difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Though I spent a lot of time in a church that was global. And almost without exception, our fastest growing churches were in countries where Christianity was the most repressed. For many decades, our fastest growing churches were inside mainland China. Maybe our society saying it's Christian, maybe our society saying it's accepting of it actually makes it harder to really see the difference. we have pretty good evidence that early Christianity thrived and grew fastest under conditions of persecution, famine, and plague.
So things should be getting better here soon.
I don't think it's bad enough yet. When I lived in Turkey, we were kind of constantly studying the Bible with people. And I remember going to meet a guy to do a Bible study at a mall. And on the way there, I heard that a priest had been stabbed to death on the street in the same city. And I talked about that with the guy I was studying the Bible with, who was from a Muslim background. And I just remember the depth of conviction he had. And the seriousness with which he took it. We were literally living in conditions of life or death. When I lived in Turkey, it was illegal to share our faith. Every time we met on Sunday, in the back of my mind is like, are we going to get raided today? You know, we have Muslims in this room in our church, and that is illegal. And that actually honestly really helped me recover my faith. When we moved there, we hadn't been regularly going to church in a few years. And being in that context, in that situation, and really seeing the difference Christianity was making in people's lives and hearing their stories, in many ways restored my faith. So, I just want us to all think about this. And when somebody tells you that this is the law that Christians are for, that this is what God wants, that this is the politics that God wants, just ask, really? Really? How? Do I really think Jesus would do this? Maybe yes, maybe no. Yes.
But not to force them to it.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't the, deal of pouring water down their throats until they actually,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if anybody's ever read the religious justification for things like the Inquisition. Yeah. They believed that if they tortured people long enough, the people would repent and therefore go to heaven instead of hell. And therefore it was their duty as the priests, as the servants of the Catholic Church, to torture unbelievers until they converted. And on that lovely note, we'll leave you for a while. I think I'm going to go. I got a break in teaching for a while. But if you have any questions, want to talk about anything, let me know. Thanks.